the chance to be here and to participate in a discussion of what I think is a centrally important topic. On the IRS building, the words of Oliver Wendell Holmes, "Taxes are what we pay for civilization," are engraved. And the question of how the nation taxes, to what extent, and how it structures its taxation is one of the most fundamental choices that any country makes. And the study of taxation has long occupied a central place in the study of economics, and it would be folly to suggest that issues of incentives and issues of the impact of taxes on incentives don't occupy an important place in that study and should not occupy an important place in that study. And certainly we as a country have had moments when we have had certain taxes at rates that were probably higher than was prudent. I have no doubt that John Kennedy did the right thing when he supported a set of tax reforms that reduced the top tax rate in the United States from 90% to 70%. I think the overwhelming evidence suggests that the reductions that took place in the late 1970s and early 1980s of top tax rates below 70% to levels of 50% or below were in order. The public policy question is not a religious do tax rates matter or not. The relevant public policy question is, in the general range where we are operating now, with a set of competing priorities, what, if any, priority should be attached to the putative incentive benefits of further tax reductions for those with high incomes? And that's the question that I want to address in my remarks this morning, and I want to make 5 observations. First, contrary to a vast amount of what is asserted, it is not clear on the basis of economic logic even what the direction of the effect of tax cuts are. To see this in the simplest way, imagine that in order to meet its mortgage, meet its desire to make a charitable contribution, whatever, a family wishes to earn $100,000 after taxes because that's what it needs to spend, and it finds itself in the 33% tax bracket. That family will choose a level of effort that will produce an income of $150,000, which after a 33% tax will lead to $100,000 of after-tax income. Now imagine that that tax rate is increased, say to 50% in this example. Then in order to maintain that level of income, the family will have to work that much harder to earn $200,000 in order to meet that $100,000 nut. Surveys where people are simply asked, what would you do if you raise your taxes, are as likely to report that they would raise their work effort in order to maintain their level of consumption as to suggest that the effect goes in the opposite direction. These kinds of effects exist in other areas. Suppose you think that after taxes you can earn 4% on your savings to plan for your retirement. You will choose a certain amount to save. Suppose happy times come and you decide that you can earn 8% on your retirement savings. Then the amount you need to put aside in order to be secure at the time of your retirement will go down. It will not go up. So the idea that raising tax rates necessarily discourages the working hard or necessarily discourages savings is simply not supported by economic logic. One can make the point more broadly. People always when they talk about capital gains, they always talk about people thinking about buying assets. But what about all the people who are holding assets right now? If you cut the capital gains tax, then it's much cheaper to sell the asset on which you already have a gain. So it's as likely that you would set off a wave of selling as that you would set off a wave of buying. So the first thing to say is that contrary to a huge amount of what is asserted, there's nothing in traditional economic theory that suggests that it is necessarily the case that cutting tax rates will provide incentives for more work, more saving, or higher asset valuations. Second thing that I would suggest is that the highest marginal tax rates in America and the marginal tax rates that cause the greatest distortions are almost certainly those on low-income workers associated with the phase-outs of a range of government programs. The fact that if you earn more money, you will lose your Medicaid. The fact that if you earn more money, your food stamp allotment will be reduced. The fact that you're less likely to be eligible for rent subsidies or with the passage of time. The highest marginal tax rates are not on those with the highest incomes. To the extent that one feels that marginal tax rates are substantially distortionary, adjustments in these programs to provide for slower phase-outs and increases in the earned income tax credit, which reduce marginal tax rates for a much larger group in the population, have a much larger impact on incentives than anything else does. And I would argue that the most important supply-side economic policy that the United States has adopted in the last 20 years was adopted in 1993 with President Clinton's leadership, spurred on by Gene Sperling, when the earned income tax credit was expanded. So my second observation is, to the extent that one decides that marginal tax rates that create disincentives are a central priority, the way to act on that decision is to focus on those with the highest marginal tax rates, who are those who are the working poor. Third observation, tax cuts that are selective can very easily create distortions. I wish the clever little remark I'm about to make was original with me, but it actually was a point that Mike Kinsley first made. He said, imagine that, he didn't say it this way, I'm going to say it this way. He said, imagine that you all of a sudden had a tax cut in which you announced that there were going to be lower taxes at only half the rate for people with the last name of Summers. What would you expect to happen 3 years later? I submit that what would happen is that there would be many more people named Summers in America, and that the special tax program for Summers people we'd be raising more revenue from people named Summers than we had ever raised before. Of course, the fisc as a whole would be substantially impoverished, because when Gene changed his name to Summers, he wouldn't like the reputational aspects, but he would like the tax cuts, and the government would lose revenue from cutting taxes on Gene, from the taxes at the normal rates on Gene. What does this have to do with anything? The essence of a tax shelter, the essence of a modern tax shelter, is that you take an economic activity, you find a way to borrow money, to deduct your interest at the ordinary income tax rate, and then to pay taxes at capital gains rates. So, of course, when you cut capital gains tax rates, in a variety of respects, you see more capital gains revenues, just as if you cut taxes for people named Summers, you see more revenue coming from people named Summers. But no one thoughtful would do the analysis of the overall revenue impact in that way, because just as you have to recognize that we're not collecting Sperling taxes anymore, so you have to recognize that a whole set of sheltering activities generate a whole set of additional shelter activities. That's the example with respect to capital gains. When you cut corporate taxes, it's not a neutral thing. Some forms of economic activity are being supported much more than others, so you're getting inefficiency arising from those differences. So no presumption that tax cuts necessarily work in the right direction. If you want to cut them on those who have the highest marginal rates, who have lower incomes. The tax cuts can't be measured just by the universe of the people who receive the tax cuts, because of the sectoral distortions that they create. Fourth observation, and if you remember only one thing I say, this is actually the most important thing to remember. Enlarging a budget deficit is an especially distortionary and dangerous form of taxation. Whether you're a supply side or you're a demand side or you're a Keynesian or whatever you are, a Democrat or a Republican, we all do have to live within the laws of arithmetic. When the government finances its activities by selling bonds, it does have to pay the interest and the principal on those bonds. Yes, it can issue more bonds, but then it'll ultimately have to pay the interest and the principal on those. That means that a decision today to increase the budget deficit is not an alternative fiscal policy. It is a commitment to tax increases and spending cuts in the future. Now, Jeff and Gene talked about how the available evidence suggests that when you run larger budget deficits, it does not typically lead to lower spending. That I defy you to find any substantial number of people in the actual economy who somehow believe that because their taxes were cut, spending is going to be far lower in the future. That means that the knowledge that we have tax cuts is the knowledge that we are going to have higher taxes in the future. We don't know the form of those taxes. We don't know when they will come. They come with substantial uncertainty. Now I ask you, which is more likely to distort activity? A tax today that falls primarily on the business you built yesterday, on the income you're earning on the basis of all your past investments, at a rate that you know and understand, or a tax increase that will come at an uncertain time, according to an unexpected formula, that will fall on the fruits of the decisions and the investments that you make in the future. I don't see how anyone can conclude that a deficit is other than a particularly large and potent tax increase. And so those who propose measures that would enlarge the budget deficit by trillions of dollars are committing the nation to trillions of dollars of particularly damaging and distorting tax increases. Note one other thing. If you raise the money today, you raise the money today. If you commit the nation to the future, $100 borrowed today at current interest rates is $180 a decade from now. And so the tax increase that's going to take place in the future is much larger than the tax cut that is committed today. So fourth argument, deficit-financed current tax cuts are in toto tax increases with all the disincentive effects that attend to tax increases. So far I've made 4 points of logic calling into question many of the assertions that are made in the political process. I just want to conclude by saying that while empirical evidence is never conclusive, it is highly suggestive in this case. There is a criterion that scientists use, which is that ex post evidence is always much more powerful than ex ante evidence. The idea is that if there's a bunch of data and you make up a theory to fit the data, well, you knew what the data was when you were making up the theory. So if you make up the theory, you make up the theory before you've seen the data, it's that much more powerful. In 1988, motivated by essentially these arguments, but looking fully at the data for the period since the Second World War, I published with Roger Altman an op-ed in the New York Times. It made the point that for all of these reasons, if one looked not at questions of inequality and fairness, where the answer is what you would expect, but if one looked at the rate of GDP growth, if one looked at how large investment was as a share of GDP, if one looked at the growth and profitability of corporations, if one looked at the performance of the stock market, one could do a comparison of periods when we had a Democratic president, a progressive president and periods when we had a conservative president adopting the more supply-side philosophy. And the data up through 1988 spoke clearly that when we had a progressive president, the performance on all of those indicators are better. Now, maybe we chose the indicators to fit the facts, all of that. We certainly were supporting a candidate at the time. Now, that theory can be subject to test. We've had 20 subsequent years. You all know what's happened. Compare what happened in the 1990s with what happened in the years before. Compare what happened in the 1990s with the 8 years since. There is plenty that we can reasonably argue about, that economists disagree about, and they should disagree because the evidence is not clear. But on the proposition that smaller budget deficits are beneficial to the American economy, and on the proposition that fluctuations in tax rates within the range of the high 30s for top individual rates and on the order of half of that for capital gains, that fluctuations in that range do not meaningfully negatively impact on economic activity, logic and evidence are as clear as is the case for any proposition in economics. We are in a period of very substantial financial instability. We're also in the midst of what is a geopolitically unprecedented experiment. For the first time in all of history, the world's greatest debtor, world's greatest power, is also the world's greatest borrower. When Britain was very strong, it was exporting capital to the whole world. When Rome was very strong, it was exporting capital to the whole world. We've never seen the experiment of the nation that is the world's leader dependent on those who it hopes will follow, lending it huge amounts of resources. I think it's very risky to expand that dependence in a substantial way. And that's what's involved in policies that run substantial budget deficits. I don't think it would harm the American economy, other things equal, to have lower tax rates. The question is how you finance those lower tax rates. And if you finance those lower tax rates by borrowing, you will get increased vulnerability in the short run, and all the negative aspects, magnified by the power of compound interest, of tax increases in the long run. That's why I don't think it's the right thing to do. Yes, you can hold out the prospect of cutting spending, but to responsibly take that position, you have to identify what spending you're going to cut. Are we going to cut back support for education at a time when there's paint chipping in the walls of too many classrooms? Are we going to reduce the total size of our investments in national security in a still dangerous world? Is that the judgment that those who advocate tax cuts are going to make? Are they going to reduce in the near term the commitments we make to our seniors through our entitlement programs? Are the costs of those actions really so small that it's something we can afford to do in order to get the highly speculative benefit of tax cutting? I don't think so. And the experience suggests that when we get large-scale tax cutting, we tend to get much larger budget deficits. And starting from where we are now, that seems to me to be a very dangerous step.